ever thought about the impacts of what you don't learn, or of what you don't see, or of what you don't know? I mean, it's difficult to do. It seems even sort of futile to try to imagine all of the things that you don't realize. But I've come to think that asking these questions is one of the most important things we can do each day. Through my career in development, I've come across dozens of initiatives, some highly impactful and some disastrous, and I've become fixated in trying to understand what causes the difference. So today I'd like to talk you through my journey as I've grappled with trying to understand what sits behind the different results and what led me to found LensShift. For me, it started with a project that I encountered early on. Let me tell you about it as a story, but from two sides. After decades of unrest caused by Joseph Kony and the LRA, Mirembe, a community leader in rural northern Uganda, decided to set up a school for children with disabilities, some who were born with impairments and others scarred by war. Alongside engaging her community to build the school, she carefully developed a community-centered financial model to ensure long-term sustainability. Wanting a unique experience in university, Ron decides to take a break. He's heard of so many issues plaguing Africa that he knows he really wants to do something worthwhile with his time off. So when he hears about a school for children with disabilities, he's immediately convinced that he must help. And though he's never worked outside of Europe or with children with disabilities before, he's confident he can learn along the way. Mirembe is wary of Ron's recent arrival and promises of unlimited funding. But her caution is overridden, and her role in the day-to-day leading of the organization is restricted. It's the only way Ron's donors are willing to pour money in. So, in the interest of the new materials and the books that the students now have access to, she keeps quiet. Ron sees the school thrive. There's a steady stream of international visitors and volunteers, and he's incredibly proud of just how much he's been able to accomplish in such a short time. He heads home with a moving story about how he saved an organization and exploded its growth. And though his friends and family who are sending money through him will no longer continue to donate, he's convinced that the school is still better off. In actuality, given the community's now shifted expectations regarding the school and its funding, Mirembe's left with the school teetering daily on the verge of bankruptcy with no long-term sustainability. The lives of 80 elementary school children is left in limbo, as there is no other school in northern Uganda to meet their needs. Now, as I watched this unfold, I was struck by the fact that both of these accounts, though entirely in conflict with each other, are simultaneously true. And most often we hear the perspective of Ron, the outsider, who might be our friend or our colleague or who we're following on social media, rather than from the likes of Mirembe, from community members themselves. Now, the case to reassess development is not a new conversation. I mean, the more I worked in this, the more it was clear that this was hardly a one-time phenomenon. If it was, Ron's story would simply be a mistake for us all to learn from and move on. But seemingly these good intention but negative consequenced initiatives seem to be quite easy to find. So let me talk you through a few to share what I began to notice. So, buy one, give one campaigns from large retail corporations have proven to be disastrous for local economies. For instance, shoe companies that promise to donate a pair for each pair you buy have been shown to put local shoemakers in recipient countries out of business by the thousands. In 2006, the US government, along with other major donors, pledged $16 million for play pumps, a merry-go-round that pumped safe drinking water. Now, at first, it seemed like the ideal, fun solution to address water disparities in the global south. But within the first year, a quarter of these pumps were in disrepair. And once the excitement and novelty of the new toy wore off for the children, women in these communities were left with the demeaning task of playing these pumps for water. Experts later found that children would have had to play for 27 hours a day to get the amount of water initially promised. In Nepal, following the Gorkha earthquake, local organizations were inundated with volunteers and found themselves having to spend more time training these inexperienced volunteers who would stay for maybe just 2 or 3 weeks, rather than helping victims of the earthquake. So, what's happening in these cases? Clouded by preconceived notions of other communities and what their own role was, Ron and other outsiders didn't realize the gaps in their own understanding. They didn't realize the generalizations they were making. They didn't realize these assumptions were actually undermining communities. And the more I reflected on all of this, the more I just couldn't help but ask, how did we get here? I mean, where do these misconceptions come from? Why do we even make such damaging assumptions in the first place? There's no way around the fact that this is a complex problem. And while there are many factors that shape how we think and what we do, I'd like to highlight the 2 that I've noticed to be the biggest culprits that often get missed in discussion: the Western mainstream narrative and educational gaps. So the Western mainstream narrative includes the media around us and the language we use. And while there are certainly exceptions to what I'm about to highlight, consider the following. Can you think of the last movie you watched, Black Panther aside, that didn't portray Africa as a homogeneous, exotic land of warlords, corruption, starving children, endangered wildlife, and jungles? Or maybe the last movie you saw that didn't portray all of the Middle East as a desert filled with camels, sandstorms, and extremists. Or how about the last book you picked up based in Africa that didn't feature the silhouette of a lone acacia tree against a gorgeous savanna sunset? A gorgeous savanna sunset. Or perhaps the last fundraising charity appeal you saw that didn't use a child or person, likely of color, to depict suffering that could be saved for just a few cents per day. Did you know that 13 times more money flows out of sub-Saharan Africa in the form of capital extraction and resource extraction and capital flight than into it in the form of aid and foreign assistance? And how about the language we hear and use in our daily lives? Whether we like it or not, this language seeps into our consciousness and shapes how we make sense of the world. Have you ever considered what the impacts might be of always hearing your country referred to as either first or third world, and how that might naturally shape a perception of hierarchy? Language is powerful. Media is powerful. Whether radio, print, TV, or movies, this narrative fundamentally shapes how we make sense of the world around us. We hear time and time again the dangers of a single story, yet often it continues to be the only thing easily accessible to us. I think the second culprit is educational gaps. It's been said that the future of any society depends on its ability to understand and reconcile with its past. Considering this, how many of us were actually taught about things like the Berlin Conference of 1884, where various European powers scrambled to arbitrarily divide up maps of Africa, as was done in other regions as well, ignoring established societies and forging many of the conflicts that persist today? Were any of us actually taught detailed accounts of what colonial and imperial atrocities actually looked like in practice? Or that the map, not the map, the continent of Africa is nearly 3 times the size that we see in the Mercator projection that's used to make most of the maps around us. Did you know that what Western education refers to as the Dark Ages was actually a time of great prosperity in Eastern and Southern Asia? Perceptions are powerful. The history we learn establishes the norms and power dynamics of a space, and the social impact realm is no exception. But this perception and knowledge disparity doesn't have to be our reality. I mean, the more I think about this, the more I'm convinced that if you really think about it, the status quo is formed by cultural norms, people's perceptions, and global policy, all of which can be influenced. So imagine a world, a socially just world, where good intentions are navigated responsibly, where everyone felt accountable to evaluate their own privilege and power, where rather than being dismissed, history is actually used as a foundation for forming policy, where communities came above all else rather than the external actors working in them. This is the world my team and I dream of as we build LensShift. We are a movement and resource hub designed specifically to address misguided development by facilitating learning, critical reflection, and discourse on social change. A growing number of conversations are underway to get people thinking about the biases in the world around them and where they come from. So by curating such resources on how to improve ourselves and this space, we're hoping to create a cohesive narrative that can help grow a community of volunteers, donors, and really citizens of the world. We all play a part in this system. You don't have to be working in development to be supporting a potentially damaging approach. The language you use, the movies we watch, the policies we support, the movements we idealize, the organizations we donate to, all play a part in allowing the current systems of power and irresponsible perceptions to persist. But now that it's clear how we've come to be so misguided, or where these perceptions come from, rather, we need to remember that these gaps and narratives determine the world we all live in. They determine not only how we see the world, but also how we act to change it. So what can we do? How can we begin to reshape this misguided collective understanding that caused Ron's mistake with the school in the first place? I think it can start with even the smallest of acts. Let me talk you through some examples. If somebody names a city in the global south and you immediately think of a poor person in a hut, Google that country. Educate yourself on what the capital city is like. Maybe look up the hottest bars and hangout spots for young people. If you come across a movie using the same old trope of an exotic faraway land whose people are either all incompetent or all evil, tell your friends not to support it in theaters. Call it out online. If you're about to say third world or developing country, don't. Figure out what other terms you could use that don't presume a hierarchy and are actually appropriate for the context. If you hear somebody referring to Africa, remind them that it's a continent and ask them to specify the country. If you come across a news piece that's portraying things in an othering way, maybe look up the news outlets from that region to get a more real perspective. Now, I know these seem tiny, but it's only from steps like these that we can start actually perceiving the complexity. That the truth is, Ron didn't need to know everything, but he needed to question what he thought he knew. Think of it this way. I believe that if our first reaction to things is from our conditioning, our second is our choice. See, it's natural for many of us to think of, say, Rwanda as a warring, genocidal place, rather than a key nation that intervened to prevent a dictator from holding on to power in the Gambia just last year. We need to foster a second reaction that questions the first, that says, what if the world is more complex than that? What if there's more to the story? What if along with being an amazing safari destination, Nairobi happens to have some of the coolest co-working and art spaces around and is at the forefront of the global mobile tech revolution? What if diverting thousands of dollars to a school in Uganda and then leaving means that the kids might be worse off than if you just stayed home? Now, I don't want you to walk away thinking that good intentions are not a good thing. They absolutely are, but they alone are not enough. If they were, the world would be fixed by now. LensShift is just getting started with this work, and we are so excited to be a reference for anybody wanting to learn and grow more. So, as I wrap up today, I urge you to remember the questions that set and keep me on this journey. What didn't you learn in your education? What don't you see about the world around you? What don't you know? This process of questioning will allow us to start sitting with complexity. Only from greater understanding can we shift perspectives, and only from more informed perspectives can we engage responsibly towards a socially just world.